Good morning, Ohio. James Ernest of the Grueling Truth, the radio network, here with Thomas Wolfe, author of The Called Shot, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the Unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. Thomas, thank you for joining us today.
James, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
It's our pleasure. So what inspired you to write the book?
Well, I was always a baseball fan. I grew up in Central Ohio. I was a Cincinnati Reds fan as a kid. Followed the sport my whole life, and as I was looking for a book project, I hit on 1932 because not only was it a great baseball season, it was a pivotal and chaotic year in American history, and I thought a book about the baseball season combined with what was going on in America in 1932 would make for an entertaining and informative book.
Excellent. I agree with you. So who is the target audience for the book?
I think both baseball fans and especially baseball fans who have a respect for the history of the game, as well as anyone who is interested really in American history and the way that sports and politics in a way intertwine. I've included a lot of material in the book about what was going on in America in 1932, the Great Depression, the end of Prohibition, presidential election year, and of course there were demonstrations in Washington, D.C. by World War I vets. There was just a lot of social unrest, uncertainty, and fear really in the country. Baseball, I think, was a diversion for Americans, partly because baseball was the only team sport that really mattered, and it gave people in the country during a troubled time something to focus on.
So why was the 1932 season one of the most controversial seasons in baseball history?
Well, there was a lot of drama. First of all, there were two great pennant races, both in the American and the National League. The National League had a very tight race. The Cubs eventually won the pennant, although they had a tough time. They had to beat out the Pirates, the Phillies, the Cardinals, who were the defending champions. Really, the Cincinnati Reds were the only team that didn't really count in the National League pennant race. In the American League, the Philadelphia Athletics had won three straight American League pennants, beating out the Yankees. Those were Yankee teams with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. But in 1932, the Yankees were the dominant team in baseball. And along the way, throughout the season, there was a manager fired. There was a Cubs shortstop who was shot by his girlfriend in the hotel. In the hotel near Wrigley Field. So there was just a lot of drama off the field and a lot of tension on the field. There were a lot of fights on the field. Even one famous fight between an umpire and the Chicago White Sox where he challenged the entire team to a fist fight.
Oh, wow.
You wouldn't see that today.
No, definitely not. So how did that season compare to the this potential season?
Well, it's going to be really hard to compare this upcoming season to anything. Even the strike-shortened seasons. It's going to be very different. We've never dealt with a baseball season during a pandemic. Not even 1918, when the Spanish flu was coming through the country. That impacted the baseball season pretty much after the season was over. I think this particular season that's coming up is going to be noteworthy, really just as a transition year, sort of historically. Hopefully we will get the season played and have a playoff and a World Series so that we have a little something to remember as we head into spring training for 2021. So I don't think it really compares to 1932. 32 was a full season with a spring training, full slate of games in both leagues, and then a very memorable World Series.
How fitting of a finale was the 1932 World Series for Babe Ruth?
How was the World Series for him in 32?
Yeah, I mean, it was his last World Series, right?
Yeah, his last World Series, and his last really good season. He led the team in home runs with 41, led the team with RBIs, batting average. I mean, he was still at the height of his powers in 32 in the regular season, although he had a couple of injuries that sort of suggested that perhaps his body was beginning to fail him a bit. In 32, I suppose the significant acts of the World Series in 32 for Ruth is, as you know, it was his last World Series. It was also against the Cubs, and although he had played a World Series against the Cubs in 1918 when he was a member of the Red Sox, he had never played a game in Wrigley Field. And in Game 3, in his first at-bat, in fact, on his first swing in Wrigley Field, he hit a 3-run home run. And then later, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about the called shot, but later in that game, he hit what is probably his most famous home run of his entire career.
So which historical figures were at that game in 1932?
Well, it was quite a crowd. Chicago was really, really excited about the Cubs pulling through and getting to the World Series, and it was an overflow crowd. 50,000 people were there. Probably the most prominent members of the audience were Judge Landis, Commissioner Landis, who was sitting behind the Cubs dugout on the third base side, and a young boy named John Paul Stevens, who later became a Supreme Court justice, who was seeing only his second Major League game, but it was a game he talked about for the rest of his life, the next 80 years. And also notable was the governor of New York, who was seated behind the Yankee dugout. It was Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Democratic nominee for president, and he was a huge Yankees fan and a Babe Ruth fan, and he got to see the Babe in person hit probably his most famous home run.
Is it true that Cubs fans and players were mean to Babe Ruth and his wife?
Yes. That's probably a nice way of putting it, to say that they were mean. When Ruth and his wife arrived at the Edgewater Beach Hotel the night before the game, there was a crowd there to, quote, greet him, unquote, shouting insults, and apparently, according to newspaper reports, someone actually spit on Babe Ruth's wife. So that was part of the tension. That was, I think, just probably on Cubs fans, just the excitement of Ruth being in the city for this game. But there was also a lot of, I would say, some bad blood between the Cubs and the Yankees, which had started with Ruth doing some trash talking in games 1 and 2 in New York. And that centered on a player named Mark Koenig, who was the shortstop on the Yankees team in the 1920s and had been brought up from the minors for the Cubs in 1932. So he was a Cub in 32, and he had been voted only a half share of World Series money. And Ruth really got on the Cubs for being so cheap and not giving his former teammate a full share of the World Series money. And that sparked quite a bit of back and forth between Cubs players and Ruth, and in Wrigley Field between Cubs fans and Ruth.
So he was trying to stand up for his former teammate.
Yeah, he was. He and Koenig had been teammates for 5 or 6 years on the Yankees. They had a couple of squabbles. They actually got in a kind of a pushing match at one point, but Ruth, I think, was just very good at needling the Cubs to sort of throw them off balance, I suppose. And plus, Ruth was such a showman. He loved being on the big stage, and he had, the issue with Koenig and the World Series share as something to kind of prod the Cubs with, and the Cubs gave it back at Ruth just as good as they got. So there was a lot of trash talking going on back and forth, so much so that even Judge Landis, the commissioner, had to step in after Game 3 in Chicago and tell both teams they needed to tone it down a little bit, that the language they were using was not appropriate for young fans.
So what was Babe Ruth pointing at?
What was he pointing at? Well, he was pointing at during his at-bat. This is the 5th inning, and the score was tied 4-4. Charlie Root was pitching for the Cubs, and the first 4 pitches were taken by Ruth. He didn't swing at any of the first 4 pitches. A strike, 2 balls, and then a strike. And after each pitch, he would hold up his fingers about how many strikes he had left. And he was saying basically to the Cubs, it only takes 1 pitch for me to hit it. So he was pointing at the Cubs in the dugout because they were shouting at him. and he pointed in sort of a general direction of the outfield with his arm raised, and we can see that on a videotape that was made by a fan sitting on the third base side. It's not completely clear where he was pointing, but he was certainly indicating that he was going to do something spectacular. And after the count reached 2-2, he turned to the home plate umpire and said, "If Charlie Root puts a pitch over the plate, I'm going to knock it out of here." And that's what he did. On the fifth pitch, he hit a home run, 440 feet or perhaps longer, completely out of Wrigley Field. And the issue and the myth surrounds whether or not he had pointed to the exact spot where the ball landed. And there's plenty of eyewitnesses who say he did, and eyewitnesses who said he didn't. None of them are alive today, but it was a fascinating subject to research.
I want to bring up the biggest controversy of the whole thing is there was a fan that had a camcorder or camera. How? In 1932? I mean, those could not have been common.
Yeah, they were not common, but there were actually two fans at Wrigley Field who were able to, with fairly primitive equipment, videotape Ruth's at bat. One is a man named Matt Kendall, and the other Harold Warp. They were both sitting on the third base side, so the two videos that were taken show that at bat from the same angle. And what's kind of remarkable about it is neither of those men were particular baseball fans. They did the videotape and sort of stored them away, and it was their relatives later who discovered it, played it, and realized this was a videotape of probably the most famous at-bat in baseball history. So the videotapes didn't come to light until much later. We're fortunate to have them, but as you note, it was certainly unusual for fans to be able to videotape anything during a game in 1932.
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, back then it was more lack of having the technology. Nowadays it's more of getting sued for recording anything.
Right. Well, and nowadays I suppose with television cameras, Ruth's at bat would have been shot from about 15 different angles, and we'd have much videotape to dissect.
So why was Joey Williams the only one to originally cover the called shot?
That's an interesting question. There were a lot of print journalists at the game, and there were radio announcers there too. Joe Williams, as you know, who wrote for the New York World Telegram, is the only reporter who, when he filed his story that day on October 1st, he's the only one who indicated that Ruth had pointed to where he hit the home run. The next day, there were several more, and the day after that, there were even more. All in all, it turned out there were 17 reporters who, in one way or another, in later reports, in later articles, indicated that they had seen Ruth point and then hit the home run. Some indicate that he pointed to where the ball actually landed. Others just that he pointed and predicted a home run. But Joe Williams is the only one who reported it in the same day that the event occurred.
So how often did Babe Ruth change his story?
There's not an exact count. It's probably double figures. When Ruth was asked later about what he had intended, I think one of his probably most honest answers was that he was just interested in getting the Cubs riled up and then shutting them up. And apparently after he hit the home run, as he ran around the bases, he said to himself, you lucky bum," because he realized he had made a pretty bold promise to hit a home run on that particular pitch, that at bat. But as time went on and Ruth was pressed, and even when he talked to Charlie Root, the pitcher who had thrown him the pitch he hit, he didn't really claim that he had pointed to the exact spot. He said he would have been crazy to do that. But he loved the story, and the story glamorized Ruth and that particular game. So he's kind of let the myth grow, and I suppose the important thing is not whether he pointed or not, but that all of us 88 years later are still talking about it.
Speaking of some of his greatest home runs, the other one that really stands out is the Johnny Sylvester home run. How does that compare to this with calling a shot?
Yeah, that's a good comparison. That occurred in 1926. Ruth was on the Yankees and was playing in the World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals. And in one of the games in St. Louis, there was a rain delay. And during the rain delay, someone came to the Yankees dugout and asked Ruth to autograph a ball for a young boy who was in the hospital in New Jersey. And that boy was Johnny Sylvester. And Ruth autographed it, signed his name, and wrote on the ball, "I'll hit a home run for you tomorrow." And sure enough, the next day, Ruth not only hit one home run, Ruth hit 3 home runs, first player in World Series history to hit 3 home runs in a game. And he later met Johnny Sylvester, and they became friends. Sylvester actually was at Ruth's memorial service after Ruth died. But that's one of the most famous Ruth stories. In the Ruth biographies on film, that story is sometimes merged with the called shot, but there are 2 different events 6 years apart.
So is Babe Ruth the greatest baseball player of all time?
I would argue he is. Not only was he so dominant in his era, and when he retired, he had the career record for most home runs by a large margin. But Ruth, of course, was also a pitcher in his early years with the Boston Red Sox, and he was, at that time, the best left-handed pitcher in baseball. He had a career record of 94 and 46. In 1916, he pitched 9 shutouts, which at the time was a record for left-handed pitchers. So I think overall, against the competition of his era, and as he stands, I think he just stands above everybody else in terms of what he accomplished in the game. So, yes, I would agree. People might argue Barry Bonds or Willie Mays are comparable in terms of what they achieved in their eras, but I will go with Ruth as the greatest player ever.
You mentioned earlier about being a Reds fan growing up. Someone was telling me when I was discussing with them about your book, they mentioned that at one point Ruth had a potential to be a Red. Was that a real thing or not?
I believe there were rumors that Ruth really wanted to be a manager, and after his playing days ended, he pursued a few leads, and I believe there were some feelers from the Cincinnati Reds about him coming to Cincinnati to manage. It never really got to any serious discussion, so Ruth didn't make it to Cincinnati.
Okay, it was worth a shot there. Yeah, because just how great that would have been, having him as part of the Reds lore, the Reds history. That would have been phenomenal.
True, very, very, very true. But the Reds have a very rich history. I mean, going back to the 1860s when they were the first professional team.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, a phenomenal tradition in history with the Cincinnati Reds. So, where is the best place to get your book?
It's available online from the notable sellers, Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I've been encouraging people to go, if they can, to local bookstores that have been so badly affected by the pandemic. So it should be available in independent bookstores. It's available from the University of Nebraska Press directly, and, of course, online.
Excellent. And where on social media and the web can we follow you?
I don't have a Twitter at this point. I have sons who are very social media skilled, and they're going to set me up, I think. I don't have a website yet, but I do have an email. And if any of your listeners are interested in talking about the book or Babe Ruth or whatever, I'm always happy to answer emails. The email is pgwolf@mindspring.com, and you can find that online.
Thank you, Thomas. We've enjoyed having you on the show today.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk some baseball history, and especially to an audience that appreciates my Cincinnati Reds.
Excellent.